Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our trip through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author, period by period, and sometimes, like the strand that we're going through now, nation by nation. And we have been hitting a bank of Russians. We have been doing Russians every day. No relief in sight. I must have organized this shelf at some point or other and just not remembered it. So we have done a lot of Dostoevsky. We've done Lermontov, and we did Anna Karenina, a couple of videos on Leo Tolstoy's epic Anna Karenina. And the fact that we did a couple of videos on Anna Karenina raised the expectation that the next thing we would do would be another Tolstoy book. But instead, stinker that I am, I threw you a curveball. And instead we talked about somebody else. We went back to Dostoevsky. And that was such a horrible thing to do to you when I know that all of you are waiting for a certain Tolstoy book that I thought I'd make it up to you today by talking, yes, you're right, about Nikolai Gogol and The Diary of a Madman. This is a Penguin Classic volume that has The Diary of a Madman, The Government Inspector, and Selected Stories. So this is... Gogol was one of the very founders of this Renaissance of Russian literature that we were talking about, and he was one of the founders that knew. He met Pushkin. He was right there at the beginning. His work was right in front of a lot of authors that we know a lot better, that the West knows a lot better than they know him, and he was all of that in the teeth of a great deal of discouragement. He was told many times in his first 20 years that he would never amount to anything as a writer, that he had no talent whatsoever. He had stuff resoundingly rejected. One of the foremost literary editors of St. Petersburg in his day was sent an early work of Gogol's and didn't just write back and say, no thanks, not for us at this time, good luck in your future endeavors or anything like that, but wrote Gogol back a Jeremiad about how bad the thing was, a Jeremiad that was longer than the work itself. Gogol burned it. Not the Jeremiad. He probably kept that to his dying day. That probably exists somewhere in somebody's attic. But he burned the work, and he burned a lot of his early work. And he was also a bit of a gadfly, creatively. He would land on a subject or a potential inspiration and latch onto it and lavish a lot of research and talk. Oh my God, could this guy talk? Talk it to death. And then it wouldn't finish. Then it would just join the long list of uncompleted works of his. And that looked to be going on. And all the while, he was having a terrible time getting any kind of paying work. Miserably unremunerative positions, one after another. And at one point, he decided that Gogol he's a canonical Russian writer, but he himself was born in the Ukraine. And Ukraine was his formative years, and his father was also a dilettante writer, and considered in his more insightful moments that Ukrainian material might be really good, might be something really good for the Russian audience in Moscow and especially St. Petersburg. And eventually, Gogol decided to try that. After having tried his hand at a bunch of other things, eventually he decided to adapt, to draw from his Ukrainian background. And once he started mixing that with a greater awareness of literature on the continent, but also once he started harnessing that tendency of his to gush and then lose interest, to gush and then stop and lose his way. Well, that kind of writing tendency to blast everything out right away, to work in a whirlwind of passion, that's short stories. That's not the 1,000-page novels that we associate with the Russian Renaissance in the 19th century. That's short stories. And once he realized that and latched onto that, the form of short stories, which one critic at the time said, oh, we're all reading short stories these days, it's all the vogue. But once Gogol decided to do that, there was a marked reaction from the public. And let's just put it that way, a marked reaction from the public. It reminds me of, there's an old quote that an original writer is not someone who writes something that no one has ever written before. An original writer is someone who writes something that can't be imitated. And as every critic has said ever since for 150 years. The same thing as this is a translation with notes by Ronald Wilkes, and it has an introduction by Robert Maguire. And Robert Maguire, in his introduction to this volume, if I remember correctly, says what critics have been saying about Gogol forever, which is that you can spot one of his stories without his name on it easily. No one writes no one writes a short story quite like him, and especially no great Russian does. And it worked. it worked. Diary of a Madman, Nevsky Prospect, The Nose, The Overcoat, all of the greatest hits are in here. And they were a hit. The first collection of these stories that Gogol wrote was a hit. And it didn't help to concentrate his mind. He was still all over the map creatively with poems and dramas and longer works and nonfiction. He had always had a dream to be a great systematic writer of history, narrative history or nonfiction of some kind or other. But again, these things were resoundingly rejected, not just by the critical authorities of the day, but also by his friends, who just said, who would just tell him over and over again, this is awful. Write another great short story. And he tried to write a great novel, and we remember him for it, Dead Souls. We remember him for that. But it's really the first half of Dead Souls that is alive. And the first half of Dead Souls, you can easily see, is just a short story. And Gogol agonized over that. He wanted to expand it, to somehow redraft it and remake it into a gigantic novel of the type that in the mid 19th century was starting to be a kind of Russian brand. His ambition always outran his attention. So he was writing short stories, and he knew perfectly well that he could do that. He knew perfectly well that he could write a short story at lightning speed, and everybody would love it. But his ambition was more. His ambition was to do more than that, which is why he died fairly young. He died in his 40s. And that's bad enough. That makes you wistful just there. But it's a little even more heartbreaking than that, because for 10 years before he died, he stopped writing short stories and turned his hand to nonfiction instead. And you can't help but think, I mean, writers aren't here to do what we want. They must follow their own geniuses. If we don't allow them that, then we will strip our shelves bare because we're profiting from that genius. But nevertheless, you look and think, oh, but if you hadn't done that, if you hadn't written on all of these subjects, these fairly formulaic and fairly forgettable nonfiction pieces, then who knows how many more stories we'd have from you instead of the 40-odd that we have. Nevertheless, this translation is very spirited, and your Russian fiction reading is incomplete without Gogol. I have maintained in the past, a long time ago, I have maintained that your Russian reading is complete if you read Gogol's short stories, but you don't bother with Dead Souls. And I maybe don't think that anymore. All it requires now is that you know a little about the compositional history of Dead Souls first. Well, if you do that, then yeah, it's very much worth reading. Very, very much worth, as long as you know some of its limitations. And it might help to know some of its limitations going in. I've had a lot of students read Dead Souls and come out saying, well, there are lots of, that was really interesting. There are lots of stuff in that I'll remember, but that wasn't a great novel. And I agree. And I get them back. I get if they made the mistake of going to that on someone else's advice first, I get them back by handing them the short stories, because the short stories always work. And they worked also, it's important to note, they worked also on Gogol's contemporaries. On the writers and also on the critics. Dostoevsky was criticized in a lot of his early stories. In some stories that weren't all that early, he was criticized, dismissed by critics sneeringly as saying that he's just doing a Gogol. He's just tarting up Gogol just a little bit, that if you want the original, go to the master or whatever. I look at some of those Dostoevsky short stories in question, and I don't see much resemblance, but I get why critics would say that, because it's a testament to the huge impact that this author had on the critical world and on the reading world. Everybody loved a Gogol short story, and everybody still does. The Nose is every bit as effective today as it was 150 years ago. So your Penguin Classic for today is a recommend as we continue with our incredibly long journey through the Russians. I want to stress again, don't get used to this. These things are mostly not grouped by theme. As far as I can remember, they are not. So when the Russians peter out, who knows what will follow them. But I guess we'll be on the road finding out tomorrow when we do another day with another penguin. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.